September 27, 1942. 4:30 p.m. 500 yards west of Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. A wooden LCP-L landing craft tears through the salt-heavy swells at flank speed. Inside the engine compartment, the grey marine diesel screams at redline, spitting thick black smoke into the oppressive tropical sun. 22-year-old Coast Guard signalman First Class Douglas Munro grips the wooden wheel. His knuckles are white. His body lurches with every violent slam of the hull. His khaki uniform is a second skin, soaked through with sweat and brine. Ahead, the shoreline of Guadalcanal isn't a postcard. It's a furnace. Hidden in the coconut groves, the Japanese 124th Infantry Regiment has opened up with Type 92 heavy machine guns. Precise, 7.7mm rounds kick up lethal geysers across the water in a rhythmic, deadly dance. On the narrow strip of white sand between the surf and the jungle, nearly 500 men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, are trapped like lambs in a slaughterhouse. They are compressed into a kill zone less than 200 yards wide. The radio is a chaos of screaming voices, dying groans, and the terrifying report of Winchester, out of ammunition. For these elite Marines, the only thin line between life and a bayonet charge is a handful of unarmored wooden boats piloted by coasties. A round clips the gunwale. Splinters spray, slicing into Munro's cheek. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't wipe away the blood. He shouts the order to his gunners. 2.30 caliber machine guns begin to hammer back. It's a slow, heavy chug, the only thing on the water capable of making the Japanese duck. This isn't a fair fight. This is wood against steel. It is a suicide rescue mission using human ribs as armor. Minutes ago, Munro could have stayed in the blue water. He could have waited for the heavy tin cans of the Navy to provide fire support. But he knew the math. Every minute of delay meant a dozen more dead Marines. He roared at his crew over the engine's whine. "We have to go in. If we don't get them, no one gets out alive." Point Cruz stabs into the sea like a jagged knife. The Japanese have set up interlocking fields of fire on both sides of the blade. American artillery has gone silent, terrified of hitting their own men in the pocket. Out on the waves, 5 small boats look pitiful against the swell. Munro's flagship has its hull number painted bold and clear. He is the biggest target on the water. He is the lightning rod for every Japanese gunner on the ridge. The sound of lead hitting the hull is a frantic staccato. Bang, 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 like a sledgehammer hitting a crate. Munro feels the wheel stiffen. A stray round has nicked the rudder cables. He ignores it. His eyes are locked on a small, frantic flag on the beach. A signalman is waving the evacuation order, risking his life with every motion. On the sand, Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller's men are huddled in shallow scrapes. Behind them is the deep Pacific. In front of them, a wall of Japanese steel. The first wave of boats was shredded by mortar fire, leaving nothing but blood-soaked life jackets and driftwood. The Japanese are close enough that their taunts carry over the roar of the guns. They are certain these 500 Americans are already dead. Then, Munro makes a move that defies every manual. He doesn't nose into the beach. He hauls the wheel over, slamming the boat into a broadside. He puts 36 feet of plywood directly between the Japanese machine guns and the fleeing Marines. He is using his boat, and his own body, as a human shield. "Everyone, speed it up. Get to the beach." Munro's voice is a raw rasp over the diesel roar. Waves wash over the deck, mixing with the dark red blood of the wounded. This is a game of seconds played with human lives. Munro knows his boat has no steel plating. It doesn't even have thick oak. It is a sea-going cardboard box made of plywood. Against Japanese armor-piercing rounds, it's no thicker than paper. But in that desperate afternoon on Guadalcanal, this Higgins boat is the only Noah's Ark those Marines will ever see. The flash of muzzle fire reflects in Munro's eyes. He is facing more than just bullets. He is facing the absolute limit of what a human being can endure for his fellow man. This was Douglas Munro, a Coast Guardsman who, in another life, might have spent his years chasing rum runners off the Washington coast. Why was he here, on this forgotten strip of jungle? And how did he use a few flimsy boats to pull off a retreat the history books called impossible? The answer is buried in the rust and the vines of Guadalcanal. In the meat grinder of Operation Cactus, Munro was about to show the world the true meaning of Semper Paratus. August 1942. The humidity of the South Pacific hangs over every Allied soldier like a heavy, wet blanket. Guadalcanal, a mere set of coordinates on a military map, suddenly became the chessboard where the United States and Japan gambled their national fates. The Americans called it Operation Watchtower, but on the front lines, the men knew it as Operation Cactus, named after the code name for the island's vital airfield. In the early hours of August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches near Henderson Field. It was supposed to be a textbook amphibious assault, but chaos began to bleed into the operation from the very first minute. At the time, the US military was operating in a total vacuum regarding large-scale transoceanic landings. The Navy was built for the high seas. The Marines were built for the jungle. In between the two, from the transport ships to the final mile of the beachhead, lay a fatal vacuum of both command and technique. This is why Douglas Munro, a young man wearing the uniform of the United States Coast Guard, found himself on a tropical island thousands of miles from home. The Navy lacked enough small boat operators. Navy sailors were trained for the boilers and giant guns of massive warships. They were not experts at maneuvering flat-bottomed boats through coral reefs, cross-currents, and shallows. But the Coast Guard, the sea cops who had spent a century battling rumrunners and storms along America's coastline, were the perfect candidates for the job. In November 1941, as the clouds of war gathered, the Coast Guard was officially transferred to the Department of the Navy. This wasn't just an administrative shift. It meant these lifesavers had to learn how to perform precision delivery under heavy machine gun fire within months. It was under these circumstances that Munro and his best friend, Raymond Evans, were plucked from the quiet of Washington State and thrust into the smoke of Guadalcanal. To understand their ordeal, we must look at the iron supporting actor of this campaign, the Higgins boat. Officially designated as the LCP-L, or Landing Craft Personnel Large, it was the brainchild of Andrew Higgins, a Louisiana lumberman who originally designed shallow water boats for swamp fishing. To a modern military engineer, the LCP-L was the definition of improvised. Its hull wasn't steel. It was made of quarter-inch Philippine mahogany plywood. There was no armor on the gunnels, the engine cover was exposed, and there wasn't even a windshield. At its heart was a 225-horsepower gray marine diesel engine. While reliable, at full throttle it roared like a dozen lawnmowers working in unison, an automatic beacon for enemy mortar teams in the silence of the tropical night. The LCP-L was 36 feet long and 10 feet wide, drawing only 3 feet of water when fully loaded. This design allowed it to ram directly onto a beach, but it also meant the boat had zero stability. Even a minor swell could leave the Marines inside retching with seasickness. The most fatal flaw, however, was that the early LCP-L lacked the iconic steel bow ramp of the later LCVP. When the boat hit the shore, soldiers had to scramble over the high wooden sides and jump into the water. In the sights of a Japanese heavy machine gunner, those few seconds of vaulting turned every soldier into a perfect silhouette. At the time, the command chain on Guadalcanal was dangerously fractured. Vice Admiral Turner commanded the transport fleet, while Major General Vandergrift led the Marines on the ground. The two sides bickered constantly over the priority of unloading supplies. Because the Japanese Tokyo Express destroyer groups frequently bombarded the coast at night, the massive US transport ships couldn't stay near the beach for long. They often fled to the open sea with their holds only half empty. This led to a logistics crisis. Thousands of tons of ammunition, rations, and aviation fuel were dumped in heaps along the beaches of Lunga Point. Who would carry these supplies to the front under fire? Who would bring the wounded back from the jungle to the hospital ships? Munro and his Coast Guard detachment were stationed at a temporary camp at Lunga Point. There were no barracks, only leaking tents draped with tarps over a permanent floor of mud. Every morning, as the Japanese scout plane nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie droned overhead, Munro headed for his boat. Their mission was monotonous and deadly. By day, shuttling between transport ships and the shore, hand-loading and unloading heavy crates of aircraft bombs. By night, patrolling the pitch-black waters for signs of Japanese infiltration. By mid-September 1942, the situation turned grim. The Japanese 35th Brigade, led by Major General Kyosuke Kawaguchi, launched the bloody assault known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge. Though the Americans held the airfield, the perimeter was stretched to the breaking point. To break the stalemate, Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller of the 1st Battalion proposed a bold, dangerous plan: a flanking landing at Point Cruz to cut Japanese supply lines and destroy artillery nests hidden deep in the jungle. Puller was a legendary Marine warrior who believed that offense was the best defense. But he overlooked a critical detail: the terrain of Point Cruz. The area was littered with coral reefs and deep underwater drop-offs. More importantly, it was the stronghold of the elite Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment. Munro was ordered to lead a flotilla of 10 landing craft to ferry Puller's 500 men to the designated beach. In the pre-mission briefing, Point Cruz looked like a smooth curve on the map. No one told Munro that the coconut groves behind that beach concealed a meticulously prepared interlocking field of fire. The Navy's cruiser support lasted only 15 minutes before stopping, as the dust and smoke became too thick for spotters to see their targets. On the morning of September 27th, Munro stood at the stern of his LCP-L, watching 500 young Marines board his boats. They checked their Garand rifles and loaded their Brownings, their faces set in a mask of grim determination. Munro checked his 2.30 caliber Lewis guns at the stern. These guns were relics of World War I, with their signature drum magazines and cooling shrouds that looked like oversized exhaust pipes. Though ancient, they were Munro's only chance for survival in a close-quarters fight. The engines roared to life, churning out clouds of blue smoke. Munro signaled the formation to move out. He had no way of knowing that this routine-looking landing was a direct path into the jaws of a tiger. In the brush along the shore, Japanese commanders watched the 10 wooden boats approach in total silence. They gave the order, "Do not fire a single shot until the Americans begin to jump from the boats." This was Guadalcanal, a game of patience and a competition of who could bleed more. Munro's hands on the wheel were slick with sweat. He could feel the vibration of the engine through the soles of his boots. This sea bus made of plywood and diesel was carrying 500 lives toward a crossroads of history. At this moment, Munro was still an unknown figure in the Coast Guard. His record was unremarkable, devoid of grand speeches. But over the next 6 hours, he would prove that when professional duty meets pure courage, a wooden boat can hold back the steel tide of the Imperial Japanese Army. The fuse was lit. Under the sands of Point Cruz, minds waited for the touch of wooden hulls. In the shadows of the jungle, Japanese machine gunners aligned their sights on the young figure standing at the helm. Back at headquarters, commanders still believed this was a successful surprise attack. The radio remained silent. It was a silence born not of success, but of the final breath taken before the storm. Munro looked toward the shoreline, where the emerald green of the jungle grew larger in his vision, a deepening abyss waiting to swallow them whole. "Prepare to land," Munro commanded. The screech of the first hull grinding against the sand signaled the start of the slaughter. September 27th, 1942. 1 p.m. The sun beats down vertically on the beach west of Point Cruz. Waves hit the fine coral sand with a rhythmic hiss. For the 500 men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, the silence is unsettling. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller stands on his flagship, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The coconut groves are thick and deep. There is no sign of enemy activity. Douglas Munro slams the bow of the lead landing craft into the shallows. The wooden hull groans against the reef. "Go! Go! Go!" Munro bellows. 50 Marines vault over the high wooden gunnels. Boots hit the water with a massive splash. They move with lethal speed, spreading into a combat formation across the sand. It is a classic flanking maneuver. Puller's plan is simple: land west of Point Cruz, push 500 yards inland, then turn east to strike the Japanese rear. Success would shatter the Japanese threat to Henderson Field. Munro watches the last soldier hit the water and slams the engine into reverse. The 225 horsepower diesel screams, pulling the craft off the beach. According to the plan, the flotilla will wait 3 miles away at Lunga Point. Munro looks back one last time. 500 of his comrades are disappearing into the emerald wall of the jungle. He has no idea he has just delivered them into a pocket designed by Colonel Akinosuke Oka of the Japanese 124th Infantry Regiment. Oka's deployment is cunning. He has no defenses on the beach. That would expose his men to the Navy's heavy guns. Instead, his troops are dug in on the Coral Ridge, a series of high ground 300 yards inland. They have carved out 2-meter-deep bunkers covered in heavy coconut logs and earth, thick enough to shrug off a direct hit from an 81mm mortar. Even more lethal is the fire plan. Several Type 92 heavy machine guns, the Woodpeckers, are perched on the heights. Precise and stable, they are set for interlocking fire. Gun A doesn't hit the enemy directly in front of it. It sweeps the zone in front of Gun B. 1:30 p.m. The 1st Battalion begins its push inland. The humidity is nearly 90%. Marine uniforms are already black with sweat. Beneath their boots are rotting leaves and thick muck. A single rifle crack breaks the air. A brief silence follows. Then, the entire jungle screams. From the ridges ahead, the gullies to the left, and the thickets to the right, 1,000 tongues of fire erupt at once. Japanese Type 99 light machine guns tear the air like ripping silk. The lead Marine platoon loses a third of its strength in less than 60 seconds. Ambush. Left front. Suppress. The officer's whistle is drowned out by the roar. The Marines try to return fire. M1 Garand's bark in a rhythmic staccato, but they are shooting at ghosts. The Japanese use smokeless powder, and their bunkers are buried under layers of vegetation. American rounds strike uselessly against coconut trunks, kicking up splinters. Then comes the tactical disaster. Puller receives fragmented reports on the radio. The jungle canopy is swallowing the signal of the SCR-284 radio sets. He hears only resistance encountered and pushing forward. Puller assumes it is a minor skirmish and orders the battalion to press on. 2:15 p.m. The Japanese 124th Regiment closes the trap. Reserve units maneuver around the flanks, cutting off the only path back to the beach. 500 Americans are now encircled in a kill zone less than 200 yards wide. Mortars. Ready. The Japanese commander flashes his sword. Type 89 knee mortars begin to rain steel. The grenades burst in the tree canopy, showering the ground with shrapnel and wooden spikes. The Marines are forced into the mud, helplessly shredded by the falling metal. The air is a cocktail of blood, cordite, and wet earth. Corpsman! Corpsman! The cries are everywhere. The battalion chaplain crawls through the mud, offering last rites under a hail of lead. A machine gunner has his head clipped by a heavy round, yet his finger remains frozen on the trigger of his Browning. The situation collapses. The Marines try to call for naval gunfire support. Offshore, the destroyer USS Monson waits, but its guns remain silent. The forward observer is dead. The gunners on the ship have no idea where their comrades are. A blind salvo of 5-inch shells would obliterate the Marines along with the Japanese. 3 p.m. The Americans are out of ammunition. Each man has less than 2 magazines left. The Japanese are moving through the trees, preparing for the final banzai charge. Their psychological shrieks echo through the dense woods, tearing at the remaining American morale. In the chaos, a surviving signalman spots a single chance for survival. They have retreated to a small clearing where the ocean is faintly visible. The radio is dead, its batteries shorted out in the muck. Signals. Use the flags. The executive officer screams. They have no flags. A soldier rips off his blood-stained white undershirt, ties it to a branch, and waves it frantically toward the sea. 3 miles away at Lunga Point, Munro is sitting on the edge of his boat eating a cold tin of rations. He stares at the calm water. Something feels wrong. By now, Puller should have signaled objective taken, but the radio room is silent. Suddenly, the base siren wails. A lookout with binoculars has spotted a white speck, a desperate signal for help from Point Cruz. Puller is surrounded. The news spreads like wildfire. The Navy commander pales. Japanese planes could appear at any moment. Japanese patrol boats are on the prowl. Who would go? Who would take a wooden boat into a storm of heavy machine gun fire? Munro stands up. He drops his ration tin and brushes the sand from his uniform. My boat is fueled up, he says calmly to his friend, Raymond Evans. Let's go. It isn't an order. It's a choice. Munro knows exactly what that beach looks like. He just left it. He remembers the hidden reefs and the treacherous currents. Hey, Doug, Evans asks as he cranks the engine. How many do you think we're bringing back? Munro doesn't look back. He just checks the drum magazines on his Lewis guns. As many as we can. 3:30 p.m. 3 LCP, L, S and 2 small rescue craft streak across the water, leaving 5 whitewakes behind them. Munro stands at the helm of the flagship. The RPM gauge is buried in the red. On the sands of Point Cruz, the first Japanese soldier breaks from the jungle, bayonet gleaming in the sun. The Marines form a perimeter, fix their bayonets, and prepare for the end. On the horizon, 5 small black dots grow larger. It is Munro. It is the Coast Guard. They are the only god those 500 Marines will see that afternoon. The true climax of the battle is about to erupt between the reefs and the sand. It is no longer a contest of tactics, but a collision of pure will. Munro's hands grip the wheel. He knows that in the next few minutes, every second will decide the fate of 500 families. This plywood Higgins boat is about to hit the brick wall of history. September 27, 1942. 3:45 p.m. The water temperature west of Point Cruz is 82 degrees. 5 LCP, L. Higgins boats are bucking violently through the crests of the swells. Douglas Munro stands in the open cockpit of the flagship, the salt spray and diesel exhaust stinging his lungs. His small flotilla is the only lifeline for 500 Marines trapped on the shore. On the beach, the Japanese 124th Infantry Regiment has realized the Americans are trying to run. Colonel Akinisuke Oka orders every available heavy weapon to the water's edge. In the shadows of the coconut palms, the tripods of Type 92 heavy machine guns are locked and loaded. Japanese infantry begin to flank the beach, attempting to squeeze the Americans into the waist-deep shallows of the kill zone. Attention! Deploy formation. Munro signals with a sharp wave of his arm. The 5 boats don't approach the beach head-on. A vertical landing would turn the bows into easy targets. Munro had rehearsed this in his mind. The boats approach in a single file, and at 50 yards from the beach, they execute a simultaneous 90-degree turn to the left. It is a suicidal maneuver. It exposes the most vulnerable side of the landing craft to the shore. But Munro has a plan. He intends to use the 36-foot wooden hulls as a temporary bulletproof wall for the Marines struggling through the water. 1552. The first wave of the evacuation begins. Open fire. Suppress that left bunker. Munro screams at Raymond Evans. Evans stands astride the stern, his hands white-knuckled on the grips of the .30 caliber Lewis gun. This Great War relic is unmistakable with its massive aluminum cooling shroud. As Evans pulls the trigger, the air rushing through the shroud makes a high-pitched whistle beneath the roar of the gun. The 47-round drum magazine spins. Chug, chug, chug. Chug, chug, chug. The muzzle velocity of the Lewis gun is lower than the modern Japanese weapons, but its steady rate of fire proves devastating at close range. Munro's boat is now just 30 yards from the shore. He can see the muzzle flashes from the Japanese bunkers. Bullets strike the sea, kicking up a picket fence of water. A dull thud vibrates through the deck. A 7.7mm armor-piercing round pierces the plywood hull and embeds itself in the engine cover's insulation. Wood splinters fly. Munro feels a searing heat in his left arm, but he doesn't look down. He is fighting the wheel, counteracting the current trying to pull his boat off course. On the sand, the first 50 wounded men are being carried into the surf. The water turns a pale pink. Get them up. Get them in. Evans shouts, reaching down to haul a gut-shot Marine over the gunwale while simultaneously swapping a fresh drum into his machine gun. This is the worst design flaw of the LCP, L. The soldiers have to climb over the high sides. In those few seconds, they are static targets. Seeing this, Munro slams the throttle forward, pinning his boat even closer to the shore until he can feel the hull scraping the coral reef. The Japanese knee mortars begin to find their range. A shell detonates 15 feet from the starboard side, drenching the entire crew. RPMs are dropping. Evans yells, "Ignore it. Keep firing." Munro roars back. He knows that if the engine dies now, they are all dead men. 16:05. The first wave is complete. Munro's boats carry 200 men back to the deep water, transferring them to the waiting destroyers. But he doesn't stop. He doesn't even let his crew check the hull for holes. Second wave. Follow me back. The situation on the beach is collapsing. The 300 Marines left behind are out of ammunition. They are throwing their last grenades. The sound of Japanese bugles is now audible over the surf. Munro's second run is even more frantic. This time, the Japanese have learned. They stop shooting at the hull and focus their fire on the cockpit and the engine compartment. Evasive. Munro hauls the wheel to the right. A burst of fire clips his helmet and shatters the radio antenna mount behind him. In the middle of the chaos, Munro sees one of his landing craft grounded on the reef, its propeller fouled by seaweed. The boat is packed with rescued men, sitting ducks in the center of a firing range. "Evans, cover me." Munro doesn't retreat. He drives his flagship directly between the disabled boat and the Japanese lines. It is a textbook shielding maneuver. He locks the rudder, keeping his hull parallel to the shore. He is now the absolute center of a firestorm from 3 separate Japanese machine gun nests. The sound of splintering mahogany fills the air. The side of Munro's boat is being turned into a sieve. The grey marine diesel begins to belch thick smoke. The radiator is pierced, and the sweet smell of coolant mixes with the stench of raw fuel. Evans' Lewis gun is glowing red-hot. He slams in his final drum. "Doug, we can't hold. The boat is taking on water. 1 more minute." Munro's eyes are bloodshot, fixed on the disabled craft. Finally, with the Marines pushing from the water, the stranded boat regains its footing and roars toward the sea. 16:20. The last Marine leaves the sand. Munro looks at the empty beach, littered with abandoned American gear, and finally orders the retreat. His boat is low in the water, the bow heavy, the speed dropping below 5 knots. The Japanese have no intention of letting the boat that robbed them of their prey escape. A hidden heavy machine gun at the tip of Point Cruz opens up. It is a precise raking shot. The bullets enter diagonally from the stern. The first round severs the rudder cable. The second hits the fuel filter. The third strikes Munro in the back of the head. He makes no sound. He slumps forward over the wooden wheel, his blood flowing through the deck grooves toward the scuppers. Evans screams, lunging to catch his friend. He grips the broken rudder with one hand and fires the final rounds from his Lewis gun with the other. "Doug, wake up." Munro's eyes flutter open. The world is fading. The roar of the ocean is becoming a distant hum. He looks at Evans, his lips moving. Did they get off? Evans looks back at the flotilla reaching safety and nods through his tears. Yes, they all got off. A faint, nearly imperceptible smile touches the corner of Munro's mouth. Then, he closes his eyes. The shattered wooden boat, carrying its hero, finally pulled alongside the destroyer USS Monson. When the medics jumped aboard, they were frozen by the sight. There wasn't a single square inch of the port side left intact. The machine gun barrels were warped from heat. The deck was carpeted in brass casings. It wasn't just a battle. It was a miracle. Of the 500 Marines who should have died that day, fewer than 20 were lost. Douglas Munro had traded his life for an entire battalion. On the shore of Point Cruz, the Japanese fired blindly into the sea in a rage. They could not understand how a few flimsy wooden boats had snatched 500 men from their grasp. The guns fell silent, but the smoke over Guadalcanal remained. Munro lay on the cold deck, his uniform unrecognizable. At Lunga Point, American planes were already taking off for the next round of the struggle. Douglas Munro, the 22-year-old Coast Guardsman, redefined amphibious warfare that afternoon. He proved that victory isn't determined by the thickness of a ship's armor, but by the unshakable will of the man at the helm when he stares down death. September 27, 1942, 4:35 p.m. The starboard deck of the destroyer USS Monson. The screech of the davits pierces the air as the pulleys strain to lift a shattered LCP-L landing craft from the sea. The boat is little more than a collection of splintered mahogany and jagged holes. Raymond Evans kneels on the floorboards, surrounded by spent brass casings. His hands are stained deep red. Douglas Munro lies in his arms, his eyes no longer focused on the world. Minutes earlier, a 7.7mm round had struck the base of Munro's skull. The Japanese Type 92 machine gun round carried devastating stopping power, more than enough to punch through the thin steel helmets of the era at point-blank range. A ship's surgeon leaps into the boat. He checks for a pulse for 3 seconds before dropping his hand. He's gone. On the deck behind Munro, the Marines of the 7th Regiment, men who had just escaped the jaws of death at Point Cruz, stand in absolute, deafening silence. Many are still caked in jungle mud and the drying blood of their brothers. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller looks down at the 22-year-old Coast Guardsman. Puller was a man known for his abrasive grit and impossible standards, but in his war diary, his assessment of Munro was a single word: fearless. Munro's death triggered a tactical earthquake at the South Pacific Command. In October 1942, as the battle for Guadalcanal reached its fever pitch, a 40-page combat damage report was rushed to Pearl Harbor and Washington, D.C. At its core was a brutal tactical autopsy of the retreat at Point Cruz. The first major reform was the immediate armor plating and redesign of landing craft. Military historians later noted that the LCP-L Munro piloted was a technical catalyst for the tragedy. The design, which forced soldiers to vault over high gunnels, led to fatal exposure times during both landing and evacuation. Furthermore, the plywood hull was practically paper against Japanese interlocking fire. This painful lesson accelerated the evolution of the Higgins boat. The mass-produced LCVP, the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, was born from this blood. It featured the iconic steel bow ramp and mandatory quarter-inch armored plating for the coxswain station. This changed every landing in the later stages of the war. Boats could now ram the beach, drop a ramp, and deploy troops in seconds while providing a metal shield against frontal fire. The second reform was the complete restructuring of shore-to-sea communication protocols. The 500 men at Point Cruz were nearly lost because Navy guns and Marine radios were on mismatched frequencies. Munro had been forced to effect a rescue based solely on visual signals and gut instinct, a scenario unthinkable in modern warfare. After this battle, the U.S. military established the Navy beach groups. Every landing wave was now required to carry a specialized communications officer equipped with VHF radios to talk directly to the destroyers offshore. They established strict backup plans using smoke signals and semaphore. This system would go on to save countless lives on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. The third reform was the total redefinition of the Coast Guard's combat role. Before the war, the U.S. Coast Guard was seen as a force for life-saving and law enforcement. But after Guadalcanal, the High Command realized these small boat experts possessed a specialized skill set that was irreplaceable in amphibious warfare. Munro's heroism proved that Coast Guardsmen were the best suited to command landing craft because they had an instinctive understanding of small boats in heavy surf. Throughout the war, the Coast Guard would go on to operate 40% of all U.S. landing craft. They were at Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and they were the first ones into the chaos of Omaha Beach. In May 1943, Douglas Albert Munro was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He remains the only member of the United States Coast Guard to ever receive the nation's highest military decoration. The significance of that medal transcended the man. It symbolized the official entry of a service once mocked as shallow water sailors into the pantheon of American war heroes. Looking at the strategic map, the stakes become clear. If those 500 Marines had been wiped out that afternoon, the battle for Guadalcanal would have suffered a catastrophic reversal. American strength on the island was already spread thin. Losing an elite battalion would have collapsed the western flank of Henderson Field. The Japanese 124th Regiment would have poured through the gap, and with the heavy artillery being ferried in by the Tokyo Express, the US would have lost its only strategic foothold in the South Pacific. Munro didn't just save 500 men. He saved the momentum of the entire campaign. After the war, the Navy and Coast Guard repeatedly honored his memory by naming ships after him, most notably the cutter USCGC Munro. On the decks of these ships, every new recruit is told the story of that afternoon, the story of plywood, Lewis guns, and a young man who, with his final breath, asked only one thing: did they get off? In the annals of military history, Munro's story isn't just a piece of sentiment. It is the ultimate expression of professional duty. His tactical judgment under extreme pressure, using his hull to block fire and organizing a relayed evacuation, remains a classic case study in waterborne extraction for special operations units today. History is written in cold data, but behind the data is blood. On the shore of Point Cruz, the jungle has grown back, a vibrant green mask over a violent past. The rusted remains of landing craft have long since been swallowed by the reefs, becoming homes for tropical fish. But for the 500 men who made it off that beach on September 27, 1942, that smoke-belching wooden boat was the most beautiful warship they would ever see. And the Coast Guardsman at the helm, who refused to flinch until the job was done, would remain their eternal guardian. Tactics evolve. Equipment is upgraded. But the spirit of the soldier who stands in the gap for others is the one piece of armor that never goes out of style. That is the truth of Douglas Munro and the miracle at Point Cruz. If you appreciate this deep dive into the tactical details and the evolution of military history, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share your thoughts on this rescue in the comments. Your support allows us to keep digging for the truth behind the battlefield. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.